Good morning, everyone. A happy almost Friday to each and every one of you. Can I quickly share a story with you? 2 minutes or less, I promise. Anyone who has worked as a bartender or served in the past knows that you'll inevitably have to deal with some loony people. The other night, this man came in while my friend Pat was working the bar. Instantly, his head drooped and he began to snooze. Pat walks over and says something like, "Hey, buddy, I can grab you a coffee or something, but please, no sleeping up here." The man responds, I'm not sleeping. I'm doing other things. Pat's like, okay, all right, whatever, and heads off to help other guests as it was a busy evening. Less than 2 minutes pass probably. Pat turns around and this guy is straight up sleeping again. So my friend walks over and proceeds to wiggle his finger and say, "Hey, wake up." This dude's head snaps up more alert than ever before and bellows, "Don't touch me, I am a nuclear physicist." and, and everyone at this point is like, okay, what is this guy on? Eventually, Pat got him to order some food and maybe a drink and stay awake for more than 10 seconds, which may have not been the best move. This bar guest proceeds to pull out a loose bag of Legos while muttering something about how Legos will soon be more valuable than Bitcoin. He slides one Lego over, $20. A second Lego, $40, $60, and so on and so on. The only downtime was while he actually had his mouth full of food, but as soon as he finished, he started full on interrupting other guests and asking them for money or what their middle name was, and that was the last straw for Pat. He prints out this man's bill, slides it in front of him, and tells him, "Hey, it's time to pay and you gotta be on your way." This man fumbles around in his pocket, mumbling the entire time to himself, gets up without pushing in his chair, and speeds out the door. So Pat walks back over to collect the money he's owed, and it's just a stack of Legos. This guy paid for his meal with 4 Legos and walked out. It made me so unnaturally happy. I just had to share that with you guys. I found out the next day that he ended up at a nearby restaurant where they proceeded to call the cops on him for continuing to bother people. Okie dokie, I just had to get that off my chest. Let's get into some murder. Today, I bring you the Dulcimer Case. My name is Eli, and this is Murder in the Morning. My sources today come from basically 2 articles, a Medium.com article and a Chicago Magazine article that I will put the links to down below. One early morning in the year 1910, the Chicago Detective Headquarters received a report of a young woman's death near Clark Street. They had been told that she had died from typhoid, apparently. Still, the captain asked 2 of his officers to investigate, Detective Williams and his partner, Alice Clement. The captain felt Alice would be interested since she felt drawn to helping the sex workers in that area in her past cases. The officers arrived at a multi-story apartment where the building's janitor waited to take them upstairs. The 3 headed up a rickety flight of wooden steps and into this woman's small room. Her body had already been moved, but the room remained intact. Detective Williams took a passing glance and immediately concluded that no foul play was afoot and agreed with past conclusions that she had died from typhoid. He deduced that she must have been living a high-risk lifestyle as a sex worker, which in turn led to typhoid. Alice Clement, however, was not convinced. She did what any good detective would do and came in with an open mind, inspecting her room closely, carefully considering each aspect, searching for something out of place, something that didn't fit. And there it was, a dulcimer perched quietly in the corner. The body of this instrument appeared new, but the strings looked almost bumpy. A dulcimer, or dulcimer, depending on where you live, and I had to look this up myself, is a stringed musical instrument. They're these long, curved wooden soundboards, mimicking what might look like an early guitar, I guess, and these could be played standing up or sitting down. She whipped out her magnifying glass and examined the instrument more closely. She found what appeared to be small granules stuck to the strings. Finding this peculiar, she requested that Detective Williams take the dulcimer back to their lab for further testing. Still convinced this was a simple, open and close case, Williams begrudgingly did as she asked. Quote, as Williams headed off with the instrument, Clement stayed behind to interview the janitor. She inquired into where or how this young woman had come into possession of the dulcimer. The janitor didn't remember seeing the instrument, but he had heard music coming from her room a few weeks after her arrival. The girl, whom the janitor called Little Miss Perry, had arrived in Chicago from another part of the country searching for work, but the poor thing hadn't found any. Alice Clement then asked about visitors. The janitor said that a few businessmen had visited, but not often, which supported Williams' theory that she had engaged in sex work. However, 3 people came with regularity. The doctor, of course, had come daily after Miss Perry had taken ill. Then, 2 settlement workers came from local charities to check in on her. The first was Mr. Grimes, who the janitor hadn't really liked. Grimes was short-tempered and complained of destitute individuals' drain on society. The other had been a woman who was always kind and sweet, but the janitor had never caught her name. Detective Clement then asked if the 3 visitors had ever come together. He answered that he hadn't seen the 3 simultaneously and doubted that they even knew each other. After interviewing the janitor, Alice hurried to the station and checked in on the results of the dulcimer strings. Williams confirmed Clement's suspicions that someone had tampered with the dulcimer, weaponizing this simple musical instrument. The culprit had intentionally placed typhoid bacteria on the dulcimer strings. If one playing the instrument had licked their fingers while playing, they would have infected themselves with this disease. End quote. Alice knew that she was onto something. Sure, Miss Perry did in fact die due to typhoid, but it wasn't a simple accident. There was more to it. Unfortunately, her partner still wasn't convinced. Who had any motive to kill this young girl? Maybe those small granules had been on the strings months before she acquired it. Detective Williams wouldn't accept anything other than an accident. Still, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that someone out there wanted this poor girl dead. And this hard-working detective was determined to try one more thing before throwing in the towel. She asked Williams to do one more favor for her and track down the origins of the dulcimer, while she followed up on Miss Perry's 3 visitors. He obliged, and the 2 split up to follow said leads. A few days later, the 2 met up to regroup. According to the Medium article, Williams reported that Miss Perry had purchased the dulcimer from a pawn shop near her apartment. A traveling musician had left it there several months before, and Williams told Clement that Mr. Grimes had visited Miss Perry's body at the morgue. His demeanor at the morgue was a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Quote, Alice put a pen in Grimes' strange behavior at the morgue and focused on this dulcimer. She puzzled at how someone placed typhoid bacteria on the dulcimer. Whoever contaminated the strings needn't have bought the instrument, they only needed to be alone with it. The idea that Miss Perry had been intentionally poisoned was not off the table as far as Clement was concerned. She asked Detective Williams to keep an eye on Mr. Grimes while she went undercover. Williams scratched his head over Alice's decision to pursue this case with no suspects and no motive, but still, trusting in her, did as she asked. A few days later, Clement returned to the station. She wore glasses and a dress. Her hair was done up in a style several years out of fashion, and she carried a briefcase filled with books on charities. This attire was out of character for Alice, who often wore the latest styles and a lovely set of pearls to apprehend criminals. Williams was amused at her appearance, but kept his teasing quip to himself as she filled him in on her lead. Clement ushered Williams to a clean and well-kept apartment on the north side of Chicago and asked for Mrs. Brent, end quote. A well-dressed woman opened the door at the officer's knock. Mrs. Brent greeted Alice and mentioned something about no longer needing a specific book. Miss Brent's smile quickly faded as Alice fell into detective mode. "Our business here this afternoon does not concern books on charity," Alice stated. "We are here this afternoon to ask why you murdered your niece, Ellen Perry." Miss Brent nearly fainted and was helped to her bedside by Detective Williams. Clement, unwavered, continued, "You have confessed by your actions that you are guilty. Now, before we take you to police headquarters, tell us why you committed this murder." Detective Williams had still not been entirely caught up on Clement's theory. Confused, he sat there waiting for this woman to speak. According to the source, Miss Brent began a tale of a person driven to do the unimaginable for the love of money. Ellen Perry had lived in a small town in rural Pennsylvania and worked as a housekeeper after her father's death. In earlier days, the Perry family had been quite well off, but after Mr. Perry's death, all that was left of his wealth was a worthless piece of land in Colorado. This land was placed under the trust of Mrs. Brent, an aunt of Ellen Perry, whom she had never met. Upon age 18, Ellen would then inherit the land and be able to do with it what she pleased. Ellen went on with her life working as a servant in wealthy homes, unaware that she owned land elsewhere. Then, one day as she sorted through her father's papers, she discovered the deed to a parcel in Colorado and wrote to this Mrs. Brent, instructing her to sell the land for whatever she could get. However, a few years prior, gold had been discovered on the Colorado track and brought in a bundle for Mrs. Brent. Greed prevented her from sharing this information with her niece, and she returned the letter stating, "Opened by mistake." Ellen went on believing that her aunt had moved on and couldn't be reached, and Ellen then moved to Chicago looking for a suitable employer. In the meantime, Mrs. Brent went to the Pennsylvania town where her niece lived, only to discover that she had moved to Chicago. Miss Brent then followed Ellen while plotting a way to keep the land and its sizable income for herself. She donned the guise of a charity worker and got close to Ellen. Miss Brent found Ellen through a fictitious employment ad placed in the local paper for a servant. She hoped that her niece would see it and apply, which is precisely what happened. Not knowing that Mrs. Brent was her aunt, Ellen took the fake job and Mrs. Brent made her move. Not long after taking the job with her aunt, Ellen discovered the dulcimer hanging in a pawnshop window near her apartment. Nursing fond memories of her father, who had played the instrument when she was a child, Ellen bought the dulcimer, and with the help of Mrs. Brent, who supplied the funds for it, she started to teach herself how to play. At first, Mrs. Brent had planned on just duping Ellen into signing over the land to her. She had begun calling on her regularly, taking great interest in the young woman while scheming. Then, one afternoon during a visit to City Hall under the pretense of a charitable service, Mrs. Brent abandoned the idea of getting Ellen to sign over the land and decided to kill the girl instead. This evil aunt spied a bottle containing typhoid bacteria within grabbing distance during her tour of the government building and wasted no time placing the dangerous vial in her handbag and sneaking it out. During her time with her niece, she noticed that Ellen had licked her fingertips while playing the dulcimer as she turned the pages on her sheet music. Miss Brent, struck with this brand new idea, raced to her niece's apartment and asked for a glass of water. While Ellen was out of the room, Mrs. Brent applied the typhoid bacteria to the strings of her niece's instrument and waited. 2 weeks later, Ellen died, and Mrs. Brent now owned the profitable Colorado land. As Ellen was fading away, her aunt, Mrs. Brent, continued to visit, sitting by her bed, nursing her dying niece. The two detectives intensely listened to her confession. Finally, Mrs. Brent asked how in the world Clement had guessed all this, or had come to this conclusion. Alice waited a moment before answering. "I didn't," she smirked. But Mrs. Brent had just confirmed and confessed to a simple theory Alice was acting on. During her investigation, Alice focused on the three regular visitors, the doctor, Mr. Grimes, and the unknown social worker. The doctor had no additional contact with Miss Perry other than treating her for typhoid, so she ruled him out. Alice then moved on to Mr. Grimes and his strange behavior at the morgue. Turns out, he acted that way around all deceased bodies, probably just a nervousness thing. This left only the unnamed social worker. Quote, obtaining the social worker's description from the janitor, Alice Clement pretended to be a bookseller and sought out the woman. When she found Miss Brent, she brought up the subjects of money and death. Clement noted Mrs. Brent's reaction to both. Her eyes sparkled at the mention of money, and her complexion became dark at the topic of death. Based on this observation, Alice Clement deduced that Mrs. Brent had killed her niece for cash. Back in Mrs. Brent's apartment, a sudden scream from the bed startled the detectives. Clement stated, "We whirled toward the bed just in time to see the woman who had murdered her niece plunge forward, blood streaming from her throat, where she had pierced it with a penknife." No further explanation ever came from her. For 10 minutes later, a physician looked upward with a weird little expression over her body and uttered one little word. "Dead." "You're dead." Mrs. Brent decided that killing herself was better off than paying for the crimes she had committed. And that, my friends, is the story of the Dulcimer Case and how Alice Clement solved it when others refused to. But before we end, there is much more to learn about this amazing detective Alice. As Chicago's first female detective, she has earned her spot in history. According to the Chicago magazine, born in Milwaukee to German immigrant parents, she could be traditional but also radical, advocating for women's voting rights and the repeal of prohibition. She took pride in her femininity, but slept with a gun under her pillow and could flip a brood on his back if the situation arose. A keen example of her independence came with the collapse of her first marriage. In an age when the word divorce was barely spoken, Clement sued her husband Leonard H. Clement in 1914 for, quote, desertion and intemperance. 4 years later, when the divorce was granted, she married Albert Faubel, the head barber of the Hub. The ceremony, naturally, was performed by a female pastor. Just what stoked such liberated attitudes and her drive to become a cop in the first place remains a mystery. Her family included no other members of law enforcement, and Clement's survivors cannot recall any stories of a special courage early in her life. It was always explained to me that her family was just a little, I don't want to say crazy, but a little strange in that way, says Clement's great-grandson Stephen. Whatever drove her, in 1913, the 35-year-old Clement took an oath as a detective. A police archive photo from the early 1920s shows just how unusual that appointment was. Of the 90-some investigators, only one was a woman, Alice. Clement took great interest in the plight of poor women and sex workers. She understood that sex work was a natural progression for some women to turn to when they could not sustain their families through low-pay work. In 1919, she even wrote, produced, and starred in a movie called Dregs of the City, where she played herself. By August 1913, with her work on the Dulcimer Case and several other high-profile crimes, Clement's talents were fully realized, and she was officially promoted, making her Chicago's first female detective. She stayed in her post, running after criminals and even going overseas to apprehend bad guys, until she was demoted in 1926 due to health concerns related to diabetes, a disease that she had kept hidden from the department. Later that year, she was forced into early retirement and died the day after Christmas in 1926. Alice Clement, folks, what a wonderful, beautiful human being. I had a lot of fun writing that one today. I actually wrote a bunch of it at the auto shop while waiting for my new tires. It was weird, but kind of relaxing. And shout out Midas in Lebanon, New Hampshire, because they gave me a piece of pizza while waiting. Alrighty then. As usual, stick around for a bonus story after the music today, and I will see you on Monday. Yeah. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you. Hi. 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 Hello. Can you imagine being blamed for the murder of your wife for nearly 3 decades? knowing darn well you're innocent? No? Good. This is the story of Roxanne Wood, written by Lauren Dunn of CBS News. In the early morning hours of February 20th, 1987, Roxanne Wood headed home from a night out with her friends about 45 minutes before her husband. When her husband Terry got home, he found Roxanne dead on the kitchen floor. He called the police and said, "My wife has been murdered. She is dead. She has been cut." Roxanne Wood took on a motherly role with her younger siblings, Brad and Janet. 48 Hours correspondent Peter Van Sant talked to Janet about her sister, whom she called Rock. "She always made people think you were her best friend," said Janet. "She just loved everyone." On the evening of February 19th, 1987, Roxanne and Terry Wood met at home after work. The couple drove separate cars to a restaurant and had dinner together. Later, they went to a nearby bowling alley where investigators say Terry played in a league. When investigators from the Michigan State Police arrived at the Woods' home, they took photos of the scene and Terry was questioned by police, while Roxanne's body was examined for more evidence. Investigators at the scene found no evidence of forced entry, raising suspicion. According to police, Terry also seemed to get belligerent with first responders that night, and when Terry was brought to the station for routine questioning, he quickly asked for an attorney, which set off alarm bells for investigators. That night, an investigator told Terry while looking into Roxanne's murder, "I believe you are the killer, and I will not rest until you are behind bars." Basically the opposite of what, oh crap, I already forgot her name. I'm so sorry. Alice Clement would do. Ugh, weak. Janet Wood said she always knew Terry didn't kill her sister. Due to limitations on technology in 1987, Roxanne Wood's murder case went cold. The Michigan police still had a tiny amount of the 1987 DNA evidence from Roxanne's case, and in 2020, more than 30 years after she was killed, they started looking into new ways to solve the case with some innovation. That same year, Professor Ashlyn Quairston and students at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan, started helping the police with the Roxanne Wood case. The students digitized more than 3,500 pages from the case file, making it quicker and easier to search through evidence and information. The officers are able to search by name and see if they've already been interviewed, things they wouldn't be able to do just by flipping through thousands of pages. Detective First Lieutenant Chuck Christensen took the investigation a step further and reached out to a genetic genealogist and president of Identity Finders International, Colleen Fitzpatrick. Identifinders International. Her company helps identify unidentified remains and people involved in violent crimes by looking at their DNA. In 2020, Identifinders started looking into the unidentified DNA left from Roxanne's case. We found out there was what I would call a gnat's eyebrow of DNA left. About 3% of what we normally use, said Colleen. It really did feel impossible. After about 10 months of testing the small amount of DNA left, Colleen Fitzpatrick discussed the case with Identifinders International consultant Gabriela Vargas. Vargas looked at the case file and generated a genetic profile from the killer's trace DNA. She then entered the DNA information into an online database. She told 48 Hours, "I believe that this case was extremely solvable, and I believe that I could solve it." In April of 2021, Gabriela Vargas used the online DNA database to start building a family tree of the suspect. That family tree led to a man named Patrick Gilham, who was living in South Bend, Indiana, not far from where Roxanne Wood was killed. Investigators surveilled this Gilham with the hope of collecting his DNA. While undercover, Trooper Ryan Cotty noticed Gilham was a smoker and knew a cigarette would be a great source for a DNA sample. Trooper Ryan picked up one of his cigarettes after having a conversation with him outside of a laundromat. On July 29, 2021, investigators brought him in for an interview. They told him he wasn't in any trouble and that they needed to question him about a very old case. Detectives showed Patrick photos of Roxanne and told him that she was assaulted. They asked him questions about her, but Gilham denied knowing her. Soon he said, "I gotta talk to my lawyer, man," and investigators let him go. On February 17th of 2022, Patrick, who was 67 at the time, was arrested and questioned for more than 5 hours. When asked why his DNA was found at the scene, he kept telling investigators, "I have no clue. I don't remember." At the end of the interview, Patrick asked for his attorney and eventually pleaded no contest to second-degree murder, and on April 25, 2022, Patrick Gilham was sentenced to a minimum of 23 years in prison for the 1987 murder of Roxanne Wood. Detective John Moore said, up until Patrick's arrest, Terry Wood was considered a person of interest. For 35 years, he labored under false assumptions that he murdered his wife. Detective Jason recalls, "I heard stories that at times he would walk into a restaurant and people would call him Slash." Roxanne's brother Brad Woods was only 14 when his sister was murdered. He says he couldn't believe the day when they finally found the guy who killed his, quote, Rock. It didn't seem real, you know? It was nothing like I had ever played in my mind of how I would be when they came to the door to say, "We got him." And that, my friends, is the extremely satisfying story of Roxanne Wood. Alrighty, I think I've probably hit my word count for the day, huh? I'll get out of your ears, but thank you all once again for listening. I really love doing this each week for you guys, so I appreciate it. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you.